everybody, to the Unfounded podcast. My name is Christopher Turner, and I am your host. I want to thank you for joining me over these last 4 weeks, this last month, with this special series that I'm doing. It's a series that I've really enjoyed. I've learned a lot from myself, and I hope you are following along with me. I hope you're enjoying it as well and learning a lot. And if you're like me, you probably have some questions, more questions than questions answered at this point. And if that's the case, don't worry, that's right where I am here with you. Hold on one second here. So without further ado, I want to give you a little summary for those of you that are just joining us. This is the 5th episode in the Take Me to Church series, a series where we try to make kind of the environment that you'd find in a church or kind of on Sunday in a non-kind of religious environment, right? If that makes sense. So I'm trying to bring that feeling of being connected to something higher to a place that's more secular so that you can engage with it. Anybody can engage with it in a less threatening way, if that makes sense. And to do that, we're referencing not only the Bible itself, we're reading through the Bible itself, but we're leveraging other resources that have been traditionally kind of either banned from being read in the traditional faiths or removed from the earlier works of the faiths, or any combination of that. Anything that's kind of taboo, unfounded, right? Hence the namesake of the podcast. So that being said, right now I have the Holy Bible here, the King James Version, but we've been pulling from the Book of Enoch over the last couple of weeks. We've read from Meditations a little bit. We've read from Paradise Lost, Milton's Paradise Lost, and we also have been referencing quite a bit The Secret Teachings of All Ages by Manly P. Hall. And I've really found quite a bit in this book itself, in The Secret Teachings of All Ages. It's a fascinating book, and I'm kind of excited today because I found some more references for the material we're going to be working on today that I think will be very helpful. So that being said, to give you a recap, we're on Genesis right now in the Bible, and if you'd like to catch up with us, we're not too far in, actually. I think we're only on chapter 9, if I'm not mistaken. Let's see here. We're on chapter 10, excuse me, on page 15. So as you can see, the Bible takes quite a while to get through. And if you're just joining us, you joined us at the perfect time, because there's going to be a lot of episodes in the future trying to get through the entire Bible. So no worries there. It'll be easy to catch up and then come back to this episode when you're ready, right? But that being said, we started with the creation of the earth. We talked about Adam and Eve. We talked about kind of the casting out of paradise, or the fall from that initial, choice to eat from the tree of knowledge. And then we also talked about and compared and contrasted Paradise Lost and the Book of Enoch, kind of the story of the watchers and the fallen angels being cast out of heaven and out of grace, to try to see if there's any similarities. And what we found over that period of time is that there is quite a few similarities in these stories, at the very least. And so we moved on to Noah and the flood and covered that over the last couple episodes. And then talked a little bit about Atlantis last week, and kind of some of the more tangible, hard evidence that they're starting to pop up in the world modern day, supporting something like the flood myths of old, right? So that kind of gives you a little bit of a synopsis of where we're at. That being said, we've also, one of the stories, the very most important story, now that I think about it, that we have been covering is Cain and Abel, and that comes right after Adam and Eve are cast out of paradise, right? But what I kind of was left feeling and realizing at the end of last episode, and we'll kind of talk about that before we get today's episode started, kind of pick up where we left off, is that the story of Cain and Abel is kind of the story of the Bible. And one thing that hit me as I was listening back to the 4th episode last week is that there's something about the Cain and Abel story that's trying to identify something to us. And I believe Jordan Peterson has talked about this before in his different series, the ones on Genesis, and then the ones on Exodus, and then now the Gospels. But that there's this theme that runs throughout. And what I realized is that I think what the Bible is trying to do, because what it tends to do, it seems to do immediately, is tell repetitive stories. So it tells the Adam and Eve story is this fall from grace, and then it goes on to tell the Cain and Abel story, and then it goes on to tell the story of Noah and his sons, and that's what we finished up with last week, was the story of, I believe it's Shem, one of Noah's three sons, who is kind of cursed by Noah because he does something kind of trivial. He goes and kind of makes fun of Noah when Noah gets drunk right after the flood on his own wine. He kind of gets drunk and celebrating, right, and passes out naked. Shem comes upon him. I believe it's Shem. Let's double check that real quick so I don't misspeak. It's actually, I'm sorry, it's Ham. So Shem, Ham, and Japheth, I believe, are the three brothers, yes. And Ham comes up upon Noah, and he's naked. He sees him, and it's kind of vaguely told in the King James Version. It kind of says he just goes and tells his brothers that Noah's naked and drunk. But what it's kind of insinuating is that Ham kind of makes fun of Noah. He has this spirit of like, you know what, I'm going to go see what the brothers think about it, instead of just doing the natural thing and covering his father up. And so as I thought about that, as I was listening back to the episode, I realized why Noah was so harsh. And we kind of realized it at the end of last episode, is that right before that, Noah's talking to God right after the flood ends, and God says, hey, basically a repeat of the story of Adam, the conversation that Noah has with Adam, kind of like he's trying to restart this thing, reset it. And he says, hey, look at all of these animals, look at all of this beautiful, all these plants and all of this beautiful food I've made for you. It's all yours, right? But here's the catch. You have to take care of it, right? And similar conversation, almost the exact same conversation he has with Adam. And so he kind of gives Noah the responsibility, hey, like, look, if this Cain spirit thingy that kind of messed up the world before, if it starts to go haywire, like, you're the one that's responsible for this. I'm placing you responsible because you're directly here. Like, you can do something about it. And so immediately after that, you have this story of Noah getting drunk and Ham, kind of making fun of him. And so I came to the conclusion, the reason that Ham does that, and the reason that Noah is so angry, is because Ham is, through that really subtle action, is showing Noah a certain type of disrespect, which then demonstrates his internal hierarchy, basically what he's praising as his highest ideal. And if it's not his father, which is what it should be, then it's something else. And when Noah realizes this, he curses Ham, and he tells him basically, you're going to be a servant of servants. And I believe that's the reason why, is that subtlety there is the Bible is commenting on each of these stories as we move forward, is trying to point out to you through different examples, a very practical thing, how you identify when somebody's hierarchy internally is backwards, when they're not praising the Father, right? When they're not praising the highest being, when they're praising something else, when they're talking to something else. And they might not even know they're doing that, but there's certain indicators that they're doing that. And one of them is demonstrated in that story of Ham and Noah. And so he curses him. And that's because God tells him it's your responsibility. If he doesn't act harshly initially, if he doesn't nip that in the bud, so to speak, the world will devolve very quickly again. And Noah knows that. So right after the flood, you really don't want the flood to happen immediately again, right? You don't want to break that covenant that you just made with God, so you act swiftly, even if it's your own son. And that's a harsh thing he does. He curses him and his entire lineage. Tells him, you're going to be servants of your two brothers forever. Wow. So that's where we left off. Today, we're moving on to one of the most foundational stories of the Bible. It's a really important one, very interesting one of my favorites. It's the Tower of Babel. And again, I believe, just from my former knowing of the story, it is kind of a repeat of that same story. And so what we're establishing here is that the Bible is actually telling a series of very simple stories, of very simple lessons, but using a bunch of different examples told through different people's experiences and sometimes different perspectives of what that looks like. And I think the reason the Bible is set up that way is so that no matter who you are, where you're from, or what your background is, you'll have some perspective that resonates with you. It's a very practical thing, I think. It's interesting, right? All right, so let's get back into the Bible. And I have, again, the King James Version here, and we are on page 15. We're in Genesis. We're on chapter 10. Now, chapter 10, and I kind of just skimmed through it before we started here today as I was preparing a little bit of the readings that we're going to be doing. And I realized that chapter 10 is one of those, as we've gone through in previous episodes, more historical chapters where it's documenting the lineage of Noah and his offspring, specifically of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And so we're not going to read through the entire thing. I'm going to read just kind of the first couple paragraphs here, the first couple of lines, so that you get an idea of the way that this is phrased and the way that it goes through the Bible when this happens, because we're not going to read through every single one of these. These are the parts of the Bible that usually get people to turn off and disengage, because it is just a historical document at this point. And the reason I want to read bits of it for you is so that you understand what it sounds like and why it's here, so you understand what the Bible is. It's not just a myth, right? It's not just an oral tradition written down. It's much bigger than that. It's not only it's oral traditions written down, but from like every tradition in history, human history, distilled into one story, right? But then also it's a historical document of those figures, so that it's trying to tell you this was real, because it knows, people knew that came before you, that you were going to think this was fake. So in order to make you know this is real, they give you lineage. This is how long these people lived. This is their daughters and their sons, and this is who they had as grandchildren, so that you know there's a very direct connection all the way from where you are standing today through the Bible to these figures, to Noah. You're related in that way, specifically because of the destruction, the cataclysm that the Genesis lays out here. Because of that, there was a narrowing point, as we went over in last episode, to Noah, meaning that Noah is everybody's great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. Yours too. If you're a human being, Noah is your grandfather. What does that mean? We're finding out as we read further. But that's why the lineage is important, right? It's demonstrating that that's real to you. So this is what it sounds like. Chapter 10. Now these are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And unto them were sons born after the flood. The sons of Japheth, Gomer, and Magog, and Madai, and Javan, and Tubal, and Meshech, and Tiras. And the sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz, and Riphath, and Togarmah. And the sons of Javan, Elisha, and Tarshish, and Kittim, and Dodanim. So you get the idea. This continues through the next half of a page onto page 16, and concludes with chapter 11, which is where we're going to start reading here. Now, another very important part before we move on past chapter 10, if you are interested and you do want to read every single line of this, please follow along with us. Go to that page. That's why I'm giving you the page numbers, and I will be updating those in both the titles of these shows, so you know which parts of Genesis, which part of the Bible we're covering in each episode, to make it easy to search, but also so that you can find what we covered, so you won't only have the citation of the Bible, but also the pages that we covered that day. If that makes sense. But one of the very important thing is it starts to identify where these different sons moved or lived in the world, geographically, where they were located. And that's important because this is what begins to create the tribes of Israel, a separation of sorts, different languages even that we start to get into, I believe, in chapter 11. And these are some of the reasonings why there's problems in the world moving forward. So again, last week we identified that there, and we don't know this, but this is more of a question that I'm kind of suggesting and postulating, putting out into the universe, is that we have assumed that God, as being something, the biggest idea we can imagine, has no limitations. But one question I'll kind of submit is, what if God does have limitations, just limitations that are so grand that we can't contemplate, so that we can't perceive them? And one of the ways that I'm beginning to see or think, the reason I'm asking that question, that might be the case is because there's change in our creation, specifically our creation. There's something different about it, that there was a problem in it. And if there's a problem in a creation, that a divine being creates, then that means it's not limitless. It's not totality, because it would be omniscient completely. Then it would be able to avoid any problems. The only way you would create the problem is to intentionally do it, which is also another potential answer, that the limitless being isn't limited, but it's choosing to ignore mistakes for some other purpose that we can't conceive of either. There's another kind of hypothesis, right? Point being is, I think we need to play with some of these questions, these ideas. There's nothing wrong with that. That's one main point, but also that we need to identify moving forward what the problem is. That's one of the things that gets missed in the story of the Bible, I think, misinterpreted, because we don't want to question God, the definition we already have, or other people already have. But if God is limited in some way, if God can make mistakes of some sort, then we need to understand where that is in creation so that we can align with it properly, so that we can understand it. And it may potentially be an answer to some of the most profound and difficult questions to answer in human existence, like why is there suffering to begin with, right? So I suggest this just so that you hold it in your head and your mind as we move forward, but that there's a problem as he reset the world with the great flood and talks to Noah. Hey, we reset everything. I narrowed it down to you. You're the beginning of everything, so take care of it so it doesn't get messed up. But then it gets messed up again. And you kind of see a little bit of it with that story of Ham and how he reacts to Noah. So the Cain spirit is still alive. It wasn't killed in the flood, the spirit of Cain at least. So it's going to be here. And then what does it do as it moves forward? Because obviously Ham isn't happy that he's cursed. I'm sure if you imagine yourself in that position, if you just made fun of your father very briefly and then you were cursed for all of existence and all of your offspring as well were going to be slaves, you might get a little bitter, a little angry. So I believe that probably took place, even though we don't necessarily have a description of that. And then you can understand why the different tribes of Israel, and the different tribes of the early world, that new world, developed different language, different traditions. In some ways even became hostile to each other. So we are on chapter 11 and page 16, and this actually specifically, the top of the page is labeled The Confusion of Tongues. Chapter 11. And the whole world was of one language and of one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said to one another, Go to, let us make brick, and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. And they said, Go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven. And let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men builded. And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language. And this they began to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. Isn't that interesting? That to babble means to speak, right? Or more specifically, to kind of speak without organization. So now we understand where that comes from. These are the generations of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and begat Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. And Shem lived after he begat Arphaxad 500 years and begat sons and daughters. And Arphaxad lived 35 years and begat Shelah. And Arphaxad lived after he begat Salah 403 years and begat sons and daughters. And Salah lived 30 years and begat Eber. And Salah lived after he begat Eber 403 years and begat sons and daughters. And so this is going to, in the middle of chapter 4, go back into more of a genealogy. So for the next, we're on line 15 there. It's going to continue on and give kind of a lineage of about 3 or 4, 5 maybe generations. And then it's going to end on page 29, I believe, at Abram. And Abram's a very significant figure moving forward. It's actually the original name of Abraham, as we'll learn here shortly. And Abraham is the father of the Abrahamic religions. For those of you who aren't familiar with what the Abrahamic religions are, that would be Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Okay? So we're going to start there where Abram. So we have about 3 or 4 generations. So that means that Shem is the patriarch of Abraham or Abram, which means Shem is the original patriarch after Noah, right? So, and then Terah looks like is Shem's great-great-great-grandson, and Terah begat Abram. And then Abram also had a brother, it looks like Nahor, and another brother, Haran, and Haran begat Lot. And Haran died before his father Terah in the land of his nativity, in Ur of the Chaldees. And Abram and Nahor took them wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. And the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and the father of Iscah. But Sarai was barren; she had no child. And Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran his son's son, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth with them from Ur of the Chaldees, to go into the land of Canaan. And they came unto Haran, and dwelt there. And the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 11. So we're going to pause there for a second and do some other reading as well and kind of talk about that, digest that a little bit. So a really important story there, and actually something I need to digest here with you as well, because the way I just set up the Tower of Babel, or at least what I thought was going to happen next, wasn't correct. So what happens next after him is not the splitting of the brothers and the development of different languages initially and nations. First, what happens, it sounds like, is all of the people, so all of the brothers and their sons and their daughters gathered together. You know, the story of the Tower of Babel at the beginning of chapter 11. And it says, and the whole earth was of one language, so everybody spoke the same language. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they had found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said one to another, Go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. So they're making all of the things they need to make a building, and then they start to construct, right, this tower. And their stated motive, as it says here, is, and they said, Go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven. What does that mean? Well, what just happened before that? You know, we have Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, so falling. Noah, another fall. You have this huge flood. Then you have Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and Noah, another kind of fall with Ham. And so then everybody's like, man, we've fallen a lot. We need to try to get back to something divine. We need to get back to paradise. How do we do that? We're so far from grace. Well, in a primitive mind, you could understand, maybe you'll try to build something to reach that place. And if the hierarchy is kind of always something that goes from bottom to top, then you know that you have to look up, right? And so this idea of building a tower, something that's tall and reaches to the sky, to the heavens, right, comes into fruition. And so everybody in one language starts to work on this tower, and they build it tall. But then it says, at a certain point, God comes and sees what human beings or man has been working on. I think it's still referring to them as man. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men. So it's saying the children of men, not men. Interesting, right? So this was, and we're going to pause here for a section as well, because we haven't talked about this since like the first or second episode, but the distinction between human and man. You know, the thing that God creates in the garden is called man. You know, not as a gender, not as a sex, but as a species, man and woman, right? And so, but what you see after that is this term children of men, specifically after the part of the Bible that refers to the Watchers, not by name, but the section that's still left in the Bible from the book of Enoch. Right there, the Bible switches how it refers to this creation that God's made, and it no longer calls it just man, it calls it children of men. Right? So what does that mean? Well, it means it's a different thing now. So now men they're a part of the process of the creating of themselves. Whereas when God created man, the original thing, it was something that only God created, right? So once you start having this procreation happening within the species, then the species starts to change itself, free will, right? This is a process that's kind of illustrated by the Tower of Babel. You could even look at the structure of the tower as kind of a very rudimentary form of a double helix. If you've ever seen a depiction of the Tower of Babel, and I'll put one here on the cover of this episode's thumbnail so you can see it. But it does have this kind of double helix structure. If you were to imagine the double helix within as like the scaffold of the structure of the Tower of Babel. So that there's a development that's kind of innate in what's being talked about here too in the stories that we're reading. So that men build this tower, we start to strive for something. And we can easily because we're all we recognize we're still related. But then the Lord comes down, and this is the confusing part. It says, behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do. So that's very important, that one line right there. They all have one language, and this they begin to do. We need to pause and think about, how is this being said? Well, what God does next is scatter everything, break the tower, right? But we're thinking of a tower figuratively, but I don't believe this is a part of the Bible that's trying to speak of a literal place, a literal thing. Maybe it could have at one point, but this is definitely meant to be figurative, because the idea of a species having one speech means that it's acting as one being, one leviathan of sorts, right? So that there's not individuality coming through in the species. And because of this, there's a certain path progression that demands that is almost becomes automatic after a certain amount of development, a certain amount of generations, right? And you can imagine that development, that progress as a certain tower that gets higher and higher and higher, but less stable the higher it builds. Yeah, something's talking right now. And so that there was a necessity to have like a mini flood. Again, this is what the Tower of Babel is another story of the flood, but it's a miniature version. God does it very quickly because it doesn't want to have to kill everything again. You know what I mean? It just promised, no, I'm not going to kill everything with a flood again, so it doesn't want to flood. It can't reset that way. It's got to nip it in the bud. It's weird how each preceding story kind of is encompassed and spoken about as a certain moral teaching or lesson in the next story, right? So you can see how there's a gestation going on here of ideas, a progression, a development of an idea, a very fundamental idea. So that the Lord said, behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do. That's how I read it. And this they begin to do? There's no question mark there. And this they will begin to do. So there's something that he's not pleased with. He's not pleased with the idea that because the idea of the tower is usually, the way I've usually conceived of it is like it's meant to reach to a height that is not meant for human beings, right? Why would you build a tower way up high when you have all of this space around you and you could build it much easier that way? What are you trying to do this for? And the idea is that we're trying to get back to God. We're trying to achieve a height that's divine. But then if God isn't pleased with that, it's trying to say, there's a lesson in that that's saying, no, that's not why you're here. I didn't bring you here to try to get back to me. So while that is maybe, because that is a fundamental teaching in Christianity, right? Hold on one second here. That is kind of a fundamental teaching, is that you want to try to get closer to God. And I don't think that's what that's meant to, what I just said. I don't think that's what that's meant to mean. Whatever's coming through right now, it's trying to say something else, but it's very specific. You can feel it, right? And it's meant to mean like each individual person was created with a specific purpose, a certain divine spark, you could call it, right? That spark has a pathway it wants to take naturally, right? And that path speaks of purpose, the purpose of initial intent of the creation. But because this creation is now a part of another process, it's not just the process that the Creator made, it's a part of this chain of evolution, I guess you could call it, in the way we described it earlier, that can get confused or lost in the soup, essentially, so that the human beings can start to work on something else besides what each individual's purpose is guiding them to do. And that's when the idea of the Leviathan I just spoke of, or this pull to development that almost quiets down individual voice and demands uniformity, that you can see in the Tower of Babel, that the uniformity of language actually produced a negative property, and one of those negative properties is a certain type of, you could imagine it in the modern day as like a fascism, I think is what it's trying to illustrate, a restriction of thought and a certain uniformity of thought, so that the individual spark couldn't come through in the society. Thus the tower kept building on itself taller and taller, even though the purpose, when half of the purpose wasn't being realized. Wow, that's really cool. It's coming through right now. I love that. So that the Tower of Babel is very figurative. And so that but the point is not only to reconnect with God as like a certain type of reunion, right? The point is that the connection, the path that spark wants to take is outlined by the photonegative, the contrast, right? So the distance that you feel from the Creator when you're born here, the distance that you feel from God, the lack of remembering that you have of what you actually are here is there for a reason, and that reason is to get you to look in a certain direction, back towards where home is, right? And the path you take through this world to get there is the work that's necessary in the world. It's your responsibility in this world, your very specific responsibility, so that everybody needs enough wiggle room in their own individual life to be able to pursue that path of reconnecting with God. But it's not the whole purpose of life. It's not, the finish line isn't the purpose. The purpose is the path. If you can understand through the way it was just very beautifully kind of channeled. Whatever just brought that through, thank you. That's awesome. I'm really liking this different way of thinking about the Tower of Babel, right? So that this is the process that was messed up in the tower, in the building that was happening, so that God says, this is what they begin to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. So because we know we can do something, we should do it, Ooh, and this is a lesson that I talked about in a recent episode not too long ago. But that just because you have the power to do something does not mean you have the right to do it. Does that make sense? The right to do it. The moral right. Doesn't mean it should be done, right? And this is a lesson that a lot of figures in positions of power over the last, so many years, decades or so, would do well to learn or should have learned before they got to those positions, because power should be wielded with respect and with a certain type of reverence is what's coming through, because it has ramifications that you can never see beforehand. You can only attempt to glean beforehand, so that you should be very cautious of those levers before you pull them, right? And only pull them when you know that that's absolutely what needs to happen, what you have to do when your path demands it, the one I just described for you. But when you're disconnected from that path, when you don't know you're supposed to be doing anything else besides what's worldly and physical, then you view power and those levers as a certain type of adult toy of the best kind, where you can make the world into your plaything. And I believe that that's what many people who aspire to be leaders in this world, in the modern world, actually want. They don't realize it because they haven't thought deep enough to understand it. But the people who are thirsty for power view the world as their own plaything. And they want to pull those levers to see what happens, because they know they can insulate themselves with those same levers from the ramifications of them. So that just because you have the power to do something does not mean you should do it. And that's what this is also speaking of, that we learned of our ability to shape the world before we understood our responsibility, or while we forgot our responsibility, so that maybe that conversation that Noah had with God about, hey, you got to keep this thing in line, maybe he wasn't able to pass that down very well from generation to generation. In the same way that you see, many businesses only surviving 2 or 3 generations after their inception, there's this process of strong men create strong societies, right? Strong societies create weak men create bad societies, and bad societies create strong men, or world, or trade in whatever word you want, but that's a paraphrase, essentially, that idea of this cycle that the world goes through. And because of that, because the conditions that produce the leader, I guess you could say, are not possible to create for the offspring of the leader. Because once you have those things, once you have stability, once you have food, once you have shelter, once you have everything you'd ever need, and you can give that to your family and your offspring, if you don't, you're actually in a moral conundrum where you're depriving the people that you are responsible for of something. So that if you were to actually do what you need to do to provide those people the conditions that you experienced that shaped you into the thing that could create and sustain something else, something new, something novel, you would have to abuse them. Not physically, I'm speaking of, and not condoning that in any way. I hope I don't need to say that, but that's the idea, right? That's why people don't do it, I guess is what I'm saying, is because in order to create those conditions, you'd have to restrict your children from having the things that you want to give them, that you need to give them, that you have a responsibility to give them. So slowly, over generations, it degrades, right? And this process, all of these processes, I believe, were at play with the Tower of Babel. This is what this very short section of the Bible is trying to relay to us. It's insane how much depth there is, right, in the Bible in these stories. So that, what does God do? Well, God says, all right, they're not going to be restrained. They're going to do whatever they're going to do. So I have to do something about this so that this doesn't continue to progress basically into them destroying themselves again. Let us go down and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the thing that he does is he chooses to use speech, ironically enough, which is also the same thing, the same piece of you that is divine, taken directly from the garden and the creation of Adam and man, right? The gift, the piece of God that God puts inside of man, the thing that makes man in the image of God is speech, is the word, right? It's the thing that God used to make everything. That's what God gave each of us. That's why you can speak. And that's through that is how we shape the world. That is one of the fundamental lessons of Genesis, the Bible itself, of religion itself, of faith itself. So that the one area that God can directly control is speech, because it is God in some way, right? It's the connection, it's the link. And so the area that God affects, the way that God knocks down the tower, is God confounds the speech of the people so that people can no longer understand each other. And you know what happens when you can't understand someone. There's immediately this huge chasm between you and them socially, where you no longer can understand why they do certain things socially, and you can't relate as easily, so that you no longer can build that tower, right? It does make sense once you break it down like that, right? So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. And it says the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, right? I believe Babel stemming from Babylon, or is the origin root of Babylon. So, which is going to be important moving forward as well, right? But that this is the establishment of this is a separation that's happening. That by confounding the language, God knows that it is a miniature flood that's happening here, that it is a destructive event and intended to be, so that there actually is more separation created between God and the creation. Because Babel and Babylon Babylon goes on to be a nation that worships idols, right? So that if God is, doing everything intentionally by knocking down the Tower of Babel, he's breaking a certain unity and a certain drive to regain paradise. He's deleting that, so that now the people don't even remember that they want to get back to paradise. Now they're so lost and they've forgotten so deeply that they will pray to anything that's powerful, right? So that's the ramification. That is the sacrifice that God makes, is, I'm going to be further away from my children after this happens now. But as we just talked about earlier, doesn't that outline a more specific path for every single person that's a part of that creation? I think it does. God's doing something with these actions. It's the long game, for lack of a better way to put it, that he's playing. But they build the city, and so I think you can see that some of the things it's trying to identify the city is very specific, right? So before this, there isn't cities, is I guess what we're assuming. The tower is the city, right? It is civilization itself. The tower is representing all of civilization, because all of civilization is one thing. As soon as God confounds language and separates those groups, the tower is shattered, and now there's a necessity to create your own cities, right? Whereas before, the concept of a city didn't even exist. So that's why it's there. But then there's other problems that come up with cities that we find later in the Bible as well, specifically with Sodom and Gomorrah, right? So, and we'll get there at some point as well. So let's pause there. That's really fascinating. Chapter 11, my goodness. So much depth popping out of that episode, that section. then I want to pause there and see what else we can find through some of these other texts, right? Because like I said, we have a lot of them to get through today, actually, and some of them are kind of interesting. So let me figure out exactly which one I want to go to from here. I'm going to stay on this subject we're on. So in The Secret Teachings of All Ages by Manly P. Hall, all sources and references will be in the show notes. I did find a couple different sections, actually, that reference the Tower of Babel. And the reason that's interesting is because this is a book that deals with the occult, right? That deals with all of the faiths and traditions that are non-Christian or non-Abrahamic, right? So this means we're doing some cross-referencing here. We're seeing, okay, if this is something that the Abrahamic traditions refer to as an actual event or something that's very foundational, fundamental, what does every other tradition say about it? Does it even exist in the other traditions? Because if it doesn't, then maybe it's not as important. Maybe it's something that's only created in that faith or used as a mechanism or tool of control or influence, right? But if it is shown in all of these different faiths, even ones that are kind of antithetical to each other, then that means that's probably true, some part of it, right? So let's go ahead and read. This is on page 134 of The Secret Teachings of All Ages by Manly P. Hall. And I'm not going to read this whole section. This is kind of towards the end of the page, the last paragraph. It just references the Tower of Babel very briefly, but it's interesting the way it does. So it says, among all the nations of antiquity, altars, mounds, and temples were dedicated to the worship of the orb of day, which is referring to the sun, right? The ruins of these sacred places yet remain notable, among them being the pyramids of Yucatan in Egypt, the snake mounds of American Indians, the ziggurats of Babylon, as we just talked about Babel, and Chaldea, which isn't the Chaldean mountains is one of the areas we just talked about as well, so very specific. The round towers of Ireland and the massive rings of uncut stone in Britain and Normandy. So that kind of brought up images in my head of Stonehenge, right? So it's connecting a lot of these different traditions here. The Tower of Babel, which according to the scriptures was built so that man might reach up to God, was probably an astronomical observatory. Many early priests and prophets, both pagan and Christian, were versed in astronomy and astrology. Their writings are best understood when read in the light of these ancient sciences. With the growth of man's knowledge from the constitution and periodicity of the heavenly bodies, astronomical principles and terminology were introduced into his religious systems. The tutelary gods were given planetary thrones, the celestial bodies being named after the deities assigned to them. The fixed stars were divided into constellations, and through these constellations wandered the sun and its planets, the latter with their accompanying satellites. Oh, and so I just realized something as I read that, and I did have a tarot card that I pulled as a bookmark for this. It is the King of Swords. A lot of blue in this card, right? So a lot of emotion, but it's in the form of the sky. It's showing up in the sky of this card and in the robes that this king is wearing, so that it feels kind of airy, more mental than deeply emotional. So it seems, if this is in the context of what we're reading here, I'm getting that the Tower of Babel, one of the problems, something's trying to point out one of the problems was why God had to do what God did and separate everything, is because as it's describing here, at least in the secular world, they would, not secular world, but in the pagan world, they would refer to the Tower of Babel as being possibly a reference of a very old, original astronomical observatory. And as I was reading that, I thought, well, that makes sense, right? What if they are talking about a literal tower of any sort, what would people be building a really tall tower to do? Right? There's not much up there. You get smaller and smaller as you go up. Usually it would be to look at something closer. What are you looking at? The sky, the stars, everything that we look at when we look at the sky, right? At least that hasn't changed to any significant degree except for the alignments to somewhat. So that it makes sense that if there was any practical use for it, it could have been an observatory. What's more fascinating as we go deeper with that is, as it speaks about here, many of the oldest religions, and specifically the polytheistic religions, were based on the identification of celestial, or the study of the stars, astronomy, and the celestial alignments, it says specifically, right? And then all of the largest or brightest stars in the night sky were given names and identities. You could think of these essentially as like the angels of the Christian pantheon, except that these different identities were assigned God status, right? So that they were omniscient beings themselves. And because of this might be one of the reasons why God had to intervene. Maybe it wasn't that. Maybe in addition to what we were talking about earlier, maybe there was a confusion that was happening. That as human beings tried to get closer to God, they looked in the wrong place. And as we talked about earlier with Paradise Lost and Milton, right? The fall of the Watchers, fall of Lucifer, the creation of hell itself, those things, if something did fall, was cast out of grace, would have a desire to get in between whatever God's focusing on now, right? So that maybe the Tower of Babel is kind of the first story of when, like in Paradise Lost, those demons, those fallen angels, and Lucifer first attempted to influence and get in between the children of men and God. So that's when the confusion starts. And because this confusion starts, God's like, this is what they're going to build. This is what they're going to focus on. God, how can they forget so quickly? I have to separate this. I have to stop this progression. Something seems true in that. They were guided too much by their mind. And Lucifer is and was the archangel of logic, of smarts, essentially, book smarts, you could think about it, but being really smart. It was the smartest of the angels, right? And tricky, right? Had the ability to deceive because of that aspect of itself. So that it could if it wanted to, and it did, right? So that quality was one of the qualities that human beings after the flood started to exude, idolize, or worship. That's one of the ways that creation became unbalanced after the flood, was that they were too logical, right? You can see it with just figuratively with the Tower of Babel and the construction of bricks. They were so focused on the physical world and making it, segmenting it, measuring it, and their kind of obsession with their ability to do that caused them to to idolize the wrong thing, to worship the wrong thing. This is where these evil, dark, low vibration, whatever you want to call them, things stepped in, said, oh, okay, see, maybe that's the reason why we started to do that to begin with. It's hard to say. Chicken or the egg, right? Fascinating nonetheless, right? So that was on page 134, and I have another section that talks a little bit more in depth about the Tower of Babel from this book. So let's go to that one, read that as well. And this one's I'm going to read a little bit more from this because it seemed like a little more relevant. I'm a little more curious too about everything it says about the tower, but this is on page, same book, 566 through page 568. And we're going to read this section, Freemasonic Symbolism. The card that I chose for this page as a bookmarker is the Two of Pentacles. Again, a lot of blue in the sky still, but there's a little bit of water on this one. So, in balance, this speaks of balancing the physical world, right? So maybe there's something, let's keep that energy in mind as we read this, because I feel like the last card really helped us interpret what that meant in the context of the Tower of Babel, biblically. All right, so let's see. Page 566, Freemasonic Symbolism. In several early Masonic manuscripts, for example, the Harleian, Sloane, Lansdowne, and Edinburgh Kilmainning, It is stated that the craft of initiated builders existed before the deluge. So there's the flood reference. And that its members were employed in the building of the Tower of Babel. A Masonic constitution dated 1701 gives the following naive account of the origin of the sciences, arts, and crafts from which the major part of Masonic symbolism is derived. Quote, "How this worthy science was first begun, I shall tell. Before Noah's flood, there was a man called Lamech." We've heard of Lamech before, haven't we? "As it is written in the 4th chapter of Genesis. And this Lamech had 2 wives. The one was called Adah, and the other called Zillah. By the first wife, Adah, he got 2 sons, the one called Jabal, and the other Jubal. And by the other wife, Zillah, he got a son and daughter. And the 4 children found the beginning of all crafts in the world." That's interesting. This Jabal was the elder son, and he found the craft of geometry. And he parted flocks, as of sheep and lambs in the fields, and first wrought houses of stone and tree, as it is noted in the chap aforesaid. And his brother Jubal founded the craft of music, songs, organs, and harp. The third brother, Tubal-Cain, found out smith's craft to work iron and steel, and their sister Naamah found out the art of weaving. These children did know that God would take vengeance for sin, either by fire or water, wherefore they wrote those sciences which they had found in 2 pillars of stone, that they might be found after the flood. Oh, interesting. So we talked about, what is that? The stone, the buried stone pillars that I was talking about. I can't remember the name right now, but it'll pop up. It'll come to me in a second. Göbekli Tepe, right? There is this theme of like, we wrote this down on stone so you guys won't forget, right? It's popping up here, right? The author of this constitution thereupon declares that one of these pillars was later discovered by Hermes, so there's Thoth, right? Who communicated to mankind the secrets therein described. So Thoth, Hermes, or Enoch. So this is identifying that Enoch is a figure, a historian, an ancient historian that is passing down this knowledge. In his Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus writes that Adam had forewarned his descendants that sinful humanity would be destroyed by a deluge. In order to preserve their science and philosophy, the children of Set therefore raised 2 pillars, one of brick and the other of stone, on which were inscribed the keys to their knowledge. The patriarch Enoch, whose name means the initiator, that's interesting, we didn't know that yet, is evidently a personification of the sun, since he lived 365 years. Interesting. Didn't know that, did we? And then we also were reading about in that earlier chapter on the tower that it was an astronomical tower, and that just briefly, I believe that chapter was labeled something about the sun. The sun, a universal deity, is the name of the chapter we read previously. Isn't that interesting? He also constructed an underground temple consisting of 9 vaults, one beneath the other, placing in the deepest vault a triangular tablet of gold bearing upon it the absolute and ineffable name of deity. According to some accounts, Enoch made 2 golden deltas. The larger, that's interesting. I'm going to pause here. So any of you who are gamers or fans of Nintendo may be familiar with Zelda. If you know what the Triforce is, this might be the source of the Triforce in that story, right? Why it's a powerful symbol and why it appears in the story of Zelda, the origin story. Well, that might be actually based on real myth or ancient account, which is why I believe Zelda is such a good series, or it's so enthralling. It's because it is, just like a lot of the Disney movies, it's talking about something real, even though the story is not meant to relay, to be historical. Does that make sense? The larger he placed, so deltas is a triangle, it's a triforce. So Enoch made 2 golden deltas. The larger he placed upon the white cubical altar in the lowest vault, And the smaller, and then vaults. Think about vaults, guys, right? In Zelda, if you've played Breath of the Wild or any of them, what do? You go in dungeons, right? And you have to go through the dungeon to get whatever is in the chest. It's all there. Isn't that fascinating? The larger he placed upon the white cubical altar in the lowest vault, and the smaller he gave unto the keeping of his son, Methuselah, who did the actual construction work of the brick chambers according to the pattern revealed to his father by the Most High. In the form and arrangement of these vaults, Enoch epitomized the 9 spheres. So Methuselah, remember, I believe, is Noah's father. So that's interesting, right? And then you remember the conversation we had was it last episode or episode 3, where at the end of the book of Enoch, where Methuselah goes and talks to Enoch about Noah being born, and Noah has this really bright hair. He looks really weird, and he doesn't look like he comes from human beings or man. So Methuselah is a very important figure too, because Methuselah apparently here is being named as one of the original founders of Freemasonic practice before the flood. Really old, right? Methuselah, who did the actual construction work of the brick chambers according to the pattern revealed by his father by the Most High in that conversation we read. In the form and arrangement of these vaults, Enoch epitomized the 9 spheres of the ancient mysteries. The 9 spheres of the ancient mysteries would be in reference to the ancient Egyptian tradition. If you remember, we read from this same book about what it would look like, what a ancient Egyptian, essentially, mass or church ceremony would look like. And there was, if I'm not mistaken, 9 different figures who would do different processions in that ceremony, and each of them symbolized a different aspect of human knowledge. Fascinating, isn't it? In the form and arrangement of these vaults, Enoch epitomized the 9 spheres of the ancient mysteries and the 9 sacred strata of the earth, through which the initiate must pass to reach the flaming spirit dwelling in its central core. According to Freemasonic symbolism, Enoch, fearing that all knowledge of the sacred mysteries would be lost at the time of the deluge, erected the 2 columns mentioned in the quotation. Upon the metal column, in appropriate allegorical symbols, he engraved the secret teaching, and upon the marble column placed an inscription stating that a short distance away a priceless treasure would be discovered in a subterranean vault. After having thus faithfully completed his labors, Enoch was translated from the brow of Mount Moriah. So this is when he was taken, it says. In time, the location of the secret vaults was lost, but after the lapse of ages, there came another builder, an initiate after the order of Enoch, and he, while laying the foundations of another temple to the great architect of the universe, discovered the long-lost vaults and the secrets contained within. John Leyland was appointed by King Henry VIII to go through the archives of the various religious institutions dissolved by the king and remove for preservation any books or manuscripts of an important character. Among the documents copied by Leyland was a series of questions and answers concerning the mystery of Masonry written by King Henry VI. In answer to the question, quote, "How come Masonry in England?" end quote, the document states that Peter Gower, a Grecan, traveled for knowledge in Egypt, Syria, and every land where the Phoenicians had planted masonry. Winning entrance in all lodges of masons, he learned much, and returned, dwelt in Greater Greece. He became renowned for his wisdom, formed a great lodge at Groton, and made many masons, some of whom journeyed in France, spreading masonry there. From France, in the course of time, the order passed into England. To even the superficial student of the subject, it must be evident that the name of Peter Gower, the Grecian, is merely an angelicized form of Pythagoras. Consequently, Groton, where he formed his lodge, is easily identified with Crotona. A link is thus established between the philosophic mysteries of Greece and medieval Freemasonry. In his notes on King Henry's questions and answers, so you see here, guys, this is important. There's a lot of figures throughout history that were referred to as different people that are the same people. Same thing that happened with Enoch, they're saying happened with Pythagoras. That this Peter Gower, the Grecian, is a angelicized or kind of a deified version of Pythagoras. meaning that these traditions were the same tradition and that Greek has Greek origin as well, right? The Masonic tradition. A link is thus established between the philosophic mysteries of Greece and medieval Freemasonry. In his notes on King Henry's questions and answers, William Preston enlarges upon the vow of secrecy as it was practiced by the ancient initiates. On the authority of Pliny, he describes how Anaxagoras, having been imprisoned in order to extort from him some of the secrets with which he had been entrusted, bit out his own tongue and threw it in the face of Nicocreon, the tyrant of Cyprus. Preston adds that the Athenians revered a brazen statue that was represented without a tongue to denote the sanctity with which they regarded their oath-bound secrets. It is also noteworthy that, according to King Henry's manuscript, Masonry had its origins in the East and was the carrier of the arts and sciences of civilization to the primitive humanity of the Western nations. It's weird to think about primitive and Western nations in the same sentence. Conspicuous, among the symbols of Freemasonry are the 7 liberal arts and sciences. By grammar, man is taught to express in noble and adequate language his innermost thoughts and ideals. By rhetoric, he is enabled to conceal his ideals under the protecting cover of ambiguous language and figures of speech. By logic, he is trained in the organization of the intellectual faculties with which he has been endowed. By arithmetic, he not only is instructed in the mysteries of universal order, but also gains the key to multitude, magnitude, and proportion. By geometry, he is inducted into the mathematics of form, the harmony and rhythm of angles, and the philosophy of organization. By music, he is reminded that the universe is founded upon the laws of celestial harmonies, and that harmony and rhythm are all-pervading. I love that one. By astronomy, he gains an understanding of the immensities of time and space, of the proper relationship between himself and the universe, and of the awesomeness of the unknown power which is deriving the countless stars of the firmament through illimitable space. Equipped with the knowledge conferred by familiarity with the liberal arts and sciences, the studious Freemason therefore finds himself confronted by few problems with which he cannot cope. So that is the end of that little section, and it went a little bit off topic from just the Tower of Babel. It was a very brief section at the beginning, but I thought it was fitting for that section to read all the way through, and I'm glad I did, because there's a couple of things that popped out there. One being, I had no idea that Freemasonry apparently can track its origins all the way back to pre-flood times. We're talking the original men, the lineage of Adam and Eve, Methuselah himself, Noah's father, I believe. So you have this unbroken chain represented there that you actually have a lot of contemporary conversations still going on about, a lot of lore and myth surrounding, if anybody's ever seen the Da Vinci Code, right? You understand that there is a lot of mystery surrounding Freemasonry. And I can speak from firsthand experience just how secretive the traditions of Freemasonry are, because I have Freemasons in my family that I didn't know about for most of my life until fairly recently, but that I found out after my grandfather passed, and this is how you usually find out unless you are one yourself, that my grandfather was a Freemason himself, not the highest ranking, but seemed that he was at least decently ranking in the Freemasons. And the reason I know that is because I found his dress and garb and his manual for ceremonies and all of that. And as a matter of fact, I have that here somewhere that I will, I'll read a little bit of for you guys when I can find it in an episode coming up here soon, because it's fascinating, right? But that being said, it's special to me because it's relevant to me, this history, right? And the reason I say that anecdote is so that you know, as a listener, that the Freemasonic traditions, I believe, actually are a little more important to modernity than we have realized and recognized. And specifically, if nothing else, if nothing conspiratorial, what they do is what that chapter was talking about, is conserve traditions, specifically in that last section, these fundamental aspects of human knowledge that are necessary for society and civilization to continue to progress, right? So that because of traditions like Freemasonry that we are learning about, there has been progress to the human species, period. Excuse me. Now, saying that, I do want to caveat that with one thing, because I thought about this as I was reading that. There is a lot of suggestion that the Freemasonic tradition is not a good tradition. And just because I have family that has been Freemasons doesn't, I still need to entertain that idea as well, right? And there is one idea that hit my head as we were reading this, and it was that in the context of the Tower of Babel, it seems that one of the things that God was trying to do after the flood, and what happened with the flood itself, it seems, was there was this lack of control, this way we had gotten off the intended path. And there seems to be, in this similar Prometheus Greek style of Prometheus stealing fire and giving it to human beings, this technological aspect to it. Something that makes it like, and this is represented with the apple and the tree, there was some knowledge that God didn't want us to have. And it's not for like a jealous purpose, right? It's got to be practical. It's got to be because if you had that, it would cause some problem. I can't control directly, maybe. And so if that's the case, then the Tower of Babel can be represented as a technological, technological symbol of humanity striving for this progression, this progress. One of the things that Rogan often talks about, and I think is spot on, is that we have, like, what do human beings do? If you were to step back as another species, if you could be an alien and look at human beings and say, like, what do those things do? What is their, like, purpose? And if you look at least historically from what we understand, we make things, right? We make things that continually make things in our conception of the world better. Technology. We invent things, right? Things. There's something about things, right? But maybe the intent of this creation wasn't to pursue things, right? What if the tower is representing that pursuit of things, of progress? That isn't the intention. And that God is demonstrating that with the story of the Tower of Babel by confounding language and separating everything. It's saying, hey, forget everything that you think you just learned. Go start again. I'm not going to kill you this time. Try again. And maybe because the reason it's a separation, 3 or 4 or 5 different cities pop up, right, is because it's an experiment. You all together didn't work, that's what you produced. So maybe a smaller segment of you in different conditions will produce a better outcome. And from what it seems like as we move forward in the Bible, we do see this more of the identification of the different development of the species and different regions and tribes, how they developed differently, separate from each other. And this is identified and kind of explained and described with the story of Abraham that we just very briefly got to with that lineage of Abram. But that Abraham outlines the right way to lead a life in the Abrahamic tradition, or at least the Christian and Jewish tradition, right? And I believe that that's the reason that's so overt, is because it's trying to differentiate itself from all of the other cities that we're developing. Think of that as a city. The traditions of a certain culture, you don't have to think of it as a literal physical city, but that forms a certain type of city that has its own current pull to it, right? And that the one that Abraham established, it was the correct one, was the closest one to the one that God intended. So that's the story that we see coming next. Whereas the other cities that are established as we move forward and we get to Sodom and Gomorrah, we start to get detailed in more specific language what went wrong there, right? What they're doing wrong, what the society's doing wrong, what is wrong with that city, that current, right? So, wow. I've really enjoyed this episode, the Tower of Babel. I I think I'm probably not going to move any further on in this one, and because I think this is about right for an episode length. And the last couple were pretty long, and it becomes harder to digest when it's huge chunks like that. This is about the length of a church service, of a mass, right? If you go to any church, and that's what I want to keep it to. With that being said, let me make sure I'm not kind of glancing over anything else that I want to take care of. I do have a copy here now, and I realize I have this huge collection that I got from my grandparents when they passed away of, it's called the Harvard Classics 5-foot shelf of books, and it's basically this huge collection of all of the greatest works in human history, right? So that you can reference them, and so that while I was talking about Paradise Lost and I was looking it up on the internet, I had the entire book of not only Paradise Lost, but all of Milton's works sitting 2 feet behind me. So I have that pulled now in case we actually want to read directly from Milton or any other work. We don't need to use the internet. We can simply use the source material, which I like. It's kind of refreshing, old school, but refreshing. Now, last but not least, before I let you go today, I want to try something out here because it's kind of a new idea that I'm playing with, and I've seen a couple people do it online, but I think it's a good idea, and I've had some conversations myself that were really interesting. So I recently became a premium X subscriber, right? And because I do a lot of social media and things, and with that you get access to X's AI. It's called Grok, and Grok's kind of fun. There's a lot of AIs out there you can use now, Gemini and all of the different ones. I can't remember all of them now, but OpenAI. But what's cool about Grok is, one, I like Elon Musk as a person, as a figure. I like to support his work. But two, it's kind of creative, a little more creative than the other ones, and it's a little more fun too. Like you can choose a setting where he's literally more fun, and he'll give you better responses, more fun responses. And I had a conversation just earlier this week where I was kind of describing what I'm doing here in the show to Grok and asking him what his thoughts were, and the responses it came back with were kind of mind-blowing and really surprising and well put. And so I thought maybe what I could do, maybe towards the end of each of these episodes, to keep things fresh, is to incorporate a little AI conversation into it. And ideally, I want to make this to where you can actually hear it so I can talk back and forth to Grok. But right now, I can't do that on the PC. But what I can do is type some questions. And so since we're talking about the Tower of Babel today, how about we ask Grok if Grok has any thoughts on the Tower of Babel? So, okay. Sorry for the little break there, but I had to type that out, and I didn't want you to just hear nothing but clickies. So here's what I got typed into Grok. I said, "Hey Grok, I am doing a podcast right now, and we just read the story of the Tower of Babel in the Bible. Do you have any thoughts on the story as it relates to the Book of Enoch, Atlantis, the Great Flood, or the development of modern civilization?" Let's see what it has to say. All right. He's typing right now. Very cool. So this is from Grok. Grok's response says, "The Tower of Babel story from the Bible intersects with a range of ancient narratives and myths, including those from the Book of Enoch. The legend of Atlantis and the biblical flood, each offering unique perspectives on human ambition, divine intervention, and the origins of civilization. The Tower of Babel and the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch, although not part of the canonical Bible for most Christian denominations, offers additional context to the events described in Genesis, particularly around the time before and after the flood. Enoch describes the Watchers, fallen angels who taught humans various arts and sciences, which could be seen as a precursor to the technological advancements and pride displayed in the Tower of Babel narrative, which is exactly what we were just talking about, or kind of postulating. So thank you, Grok. You can see how useful this is. It's very cool. They can kind of confirm, hey, AI can help you in your research, but at least we can tell that we're kind of on the right track there with that idea that the Tower of Babel is meant to figuratively represent, in at least some retellings, technology, or the striving for technological advancement, right? Now, what's interesting about that, as I was talking about with the Freemasons, is if the Freemasons is the tradition that conserves those teachings, that technology of sorts, and if Enoch is the figure in history that after the flood wrote all of this on the pillars, one of stone is said, and one of brick, or one of steel and one of brick, then, and this is the thought that hit my head that I forgot to talk about, is doesn't that mean that that's against God's will? Doesn't that mean that, isn't, as we talked about the Tower of Babel and why God would confound language, didn't we come to the conclusion, I kind of came to the conclusion that it's doing that because we're chasing the wrong thing, right? So that God confounds language and separates everything, and then we conserve it anyway. I don't know what I'm coming to it necessarily means, but I think what it means is the way I'm talking to you right now, using a computer, and the way I'm recording this, and podcasts in general, and cell phones, and technology itself, while it's not innately evil or bad or hurtful or harmful or any of those things, it has the potential to be. And one thing I think I can say fairly confidently after today's episode is it wasn't whatever created us, it wasn't its intention for us to create that. Maybe it wasn't its intention for us to have to create these things. Maybe the aspects of paradise, the original place, removed the necessity for technology. Really, if you think about it, technology is necessary. We strive because we're trying to improve our lives. It is the Tower of Babel, us trying to get back to paradise. Making AI, all of these robots, imagining what a future would look like when we had all this technology doing what we wanted to do. And what does it do? The things you don't want to do for you, right? What would paradise be? A place where you don't have to do those things, right? So what we're really trying to do is get back to paradise. Always, constantly. We were before Noah, and we still were after Noah. And it's represented very specifically with the story of the Tower of Babel. So what does that mean? We didn't learn our lesson. And I have a feeling that through the rest of the Bible, we're still not going to learn our lesson. And I have a feeling that we get to Jesus and we still don't learn our lesson. So what does that mean today? Didn't learn a lesson. And with that, that's the Unfounded podcast for today. Lots of love.